beach on the Norwegian coast, June 1945. A German soldier, still in Wehrmacht uniform weeks after his country's surrender, walks forward across sand. He helped mine himself less than a year earlier, a metal probe held low in one hand, moving inch by inch through ground, his own engineers once seeded with explosives to stop an Allied landing that never came here. Behind him, a line of comrades advances at the same careful pace, spaced widely apart, each man alone with the specific patch of earth in front of him. Somewhere down that line, before the day is finished, the ground will do what it was built to do. The war in Europe is over. For these men it has not ended. It has simply changed its shape, from a war fought with weapons to one paid off with labor, sweat, and in places like this, blood-spilled clearing hazards their own side had planted. This is not where victory begins to be enjoyed. It is where the losing side starts working off its debt. One minefield, one coal seam, one harvest at a time. The scale of what followed VE Day sits awkwardly alongside the tidy narrative of liberation that dominates most popular memory of 1945. Across the whole of Allied-occupied Europe, and stretching as far as camps in Canada and the American Midwest, an enormous population of German prisoners of war, and in some cases ordinary civilians swept up alongside them, found themselves not released but redirected, sent into coal mines, onto farms, into forests, and out across minefields, their labor treated by the victorious powers as a legitimate, negotiable form of war reparations. This was not incidental policy improvised at the last minute. It had been discussed at the highest level of Allied diplomacy years before the guns fell silent. At conferences where German manpower was weighed alongside factories and machinery as something owed to the countries Germany had devastated. In France, this became one of the defining features of the country's early reconstruction. German prisoners under French control worked coal seams in the industrial north, labored in the vineyards and wheat fields of the countryside, and rebuilt roads and rail lines shattered by years of occupation and Allied bombing. French officials negotiating with their American counterparts over the eventual release of these prisoners argued with evident anxiety that removing this workforce too quickly would cripple both agriculture and the coal industry at precisely the moment the country could least afford it. The war had ended for France in the sense that matters most. The fighting had stopped, but its economy had quietly built a dependency on captured German labor that no armistice could immediately unwind. Britain's experience followed a similar shape, though its bureaucratic path proved more tangled and more openly contested at home. German prisoners already present in Britain when the war ended were not simply held in place until repatriation could be arranged. Instead, their numbers grew substantially in the months that followed, as men captured by American forces elsewhere in Europe were rerouted across the Atlantic into British camps rather than sent directly home, arriving to be set to work almost immediately rather than processed for release. Across the British countryside, these prisoners became an essential and visible part of agricultural life, working alongside, and sometimes living in close proximity to, the very communities whose sons had fought against them only months before. The men who had once faced British soldiers across the beaches and hedgerows of Normandy were now bringing in the harvest that fed the families of those same soldiers. The friction in this arrangement rarely appears in official communiqué, but it shaped daily conditions with real severity. Through the first brutal winter after the war, a significant portion of German prisoners held in Britain remained housed in tents rather than proper barracks, an arrangement that sat uneasily against the international conventions meant to govern prisoner treatment, particularly once the war that had justified their original capture was unmistakably in the past. Internal British correspondence from this period reveals officials wrestling openly with the contradiction at the heart of the policy, acknowledging that any continued use of prisoner labor needed to stay within categories that international law permitted, while simultaneously working to extend that labor and the reparations value it represented for as long as diplomatically possible. It was not hypocrisy exactly. It was closer to a government trying to have both a clear conscience and a functioning harvest at the same time. In the Soviet Union, the scale of this arrangement dwarfed anything seen in France or Britain, and the conditions endured by prisoners proved harsher by a wide margin. A substantial share of the German soldiers captured by Soviet forces during the war's final year, never returned home in any time frame resembling what Western Allied prisoners experienced. Many remained for years, some for the better part of a decade, working mines, forests, and reconstruction projects across a Soviet economy, left devastated by an occupation that had killed millions and destroyed vast stretches of industrial and agricultural infrastructure. German civilians from the Eastern occupation zone were, in a number of documented cases, deported directly into Soviet territory for the same purpose, administered through camp systems that operated with minimal outside oversight and correspondingly thin documentation of the conditions inside them. Mine clearance, more than any other single task assigned to former German soldiers, exposed the moral ambiguity sitting at the heart of the entire post-war labor program. Across the Norwegian coast, where German forces had constructed extensive defenses against an Allied invasion that ultimately came through France instead, prisoners were assigned to clear the very ground they, or men in their own units, had mined during the occupation. German objections that this violated international protections against assigning prisoners to dangerous or unhealthy work were dismissed on a legal technicality. Occupying authorities classified these men not as prisoners of war in the formal sense, but as disarmed enemy forces who had surrendered unconditionally, a distinction that carried no practical meaning to a man walking a probe through sand, but one that conveniently placed the entire clearance operation outside the protections a prisoner of war would otherwise have held. Casualties mounted steadily through that first summer before the operation was quietly paused, resuming only later under considerably improved conditions, better pay, clearer medical guarantees, and, notably, a workforce that increasingly volunteered rather than being assigned outright. Repatriation, when it eventually came, arrived on wildly different timelines depending entirely on which occupying power happened to hold a given prisoner. Those in American custody found their way home relatively quickly. Britain's release process began in earnest, roughly a year and a half after the war's end, and dragged on for years afterward before the last men were finally freed, a process so protracted that some prisoners spent longer in post-war captivity working British farms than they had spent as active combatants during the war itself. Not everyone chose to leave when the opportunity finally came. A meaningful number of former prisoners elected to remain in Britain voluntarily as civilian workers. Having built lives, friendships, and in some cases families during their years of captivity, a quietly human coda to a program that had begun purely as forced extraction and ended, for some, as something closer to permanent settlement in the country that had once held them prisoner. Debriefing assessed as a labor mobilization and reparations problem rather than a military campaign, the post-war use of German prisoner labor reveals three defining pressures and one uncomfortable legacy. First, the depth of Europe's reconstruction needs, particularly in coal agriculture and rebuilding shattered infrastructure, made rapid and unconditional repatriation economically unthinkable for both France and Britain, regardless of what post-war conventions implied about how quickly prisoners should be released once active hostilities had ended. Second, legal classification functioned as a tool of policy rather than a neutral description of status. The distinction drawn between a genuine prisoner of war and a merely disarmed enemy combatant, applied inconsistently across different occupied territories, determined which protections a man received and which especially dangerous tasks, mine clearance chief among them, could be legally assigned to him. Third, national approaches diverged sharply in both scale and severity. France and Britain operated, however imperfectly, within a framework that retained some accountability to international norms and eventually produced a defined, if repeatedly delayed, path toward release. The Soviet Union largely operated outside that framework, retaining a substantial share of its prisoners for years, with minimal external oversight of their treatment. The uncomfortable legacy is one rarely foregrounded in the victory narratives that dominate popular memory of this period. The physical reconstruction of Western Europe's coal mines, farms, and cleared coastlines depended, in no small part, on the labor of the very army that had, only months earlier, been fought to a standstill on the battlefield, a debt collected not in currency, but in years of a defeated nation's own working population.